Taleblu joins us from Hong Kong. He is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And CBS News White House correspondent Paula Reed joins us from the White House. Paula, let's start with you. What more do we know about the sanctions and what they aim to accomplish?
Well, these sanctions target the supreme leader of Iran and his associates. It's an effort by the Trump administration to put further pressure on Tehran, although their economy is arguably already crippled by the existing sanctions. And what's not clear about what the president did today is how these sanctions are any different from what was already in place. Most of the people named in these, the supreme leader, his associates, they're already impacted by existing sanctions. So it's unclear how this is anything different. It appears that those who could potentially be impacted here are anyone seeking to do business with the supreme leader or his associates who are not already covered by existing sanctions.
Behnam, how does targeting the Ayatollah specifically differ from the previous sanctions the U.S. placed on Iran before this?
Well, great to be with you, and great question, because the Ayatollah has a massive holding company, as well as a series of front companies, and is linked to a series of parastatal institutions that controls a major part of Iran's economy. And while several elements of these have been sanctioned over time, the massive architecture is really yet to be tackled. And going after that architecture, I think, if that is what the administration is doing, would deal a serious blow to Iran's economy, as well as to entities on Iran's stock exchange that may have controlling shares by several of these Ayatollah-owned holding companies. And again, some of those associates that I think was just mentioned have not all been sanctioned. In fact, there is one that was reported. His name is Amir Ali Hajizadeh. He's the commander of Iran's aerospace force for its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Europeans, in fact, have sanctioned him, and the Americans have not. So in some ways, going after some of these military associates establishes parity when it comes to sanctions against Iran with our allies.
And you know, that's a really interesting point. Paula, let's talk about that. It seems that the president opted for sanctions instead of a military strike. Why did he go the economic route instead? Did he feel that would be more effective?
He said that he did not believe a military strike, certainly not one that could potentially result in casualties, was proportional to the shooting down of a drone, the U.S. says, over international waters. The administration has not confirmed any other retaliatory measures like cyber attacks or anything like that. But look, the fact is the president campaigned on a promise not to entangle the U.S. in any more, quote, forever wars. There are many people around the president who believe that if he was to greenlight military action or engage militarily with Iran, that would really put a damper on his chances of re-election. So a lot of this, too, is political, not just logistical.
And Behnam, we heard from the Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin not too long ago saying that the U.S. did not consult allies in determining these new set of sanctions. Do you think that that could be problematic for the administration?
Well, given that I think one of these individuals has been sanctioned by the Europeans and wasn't sanctioned by the Americans, no, not necessarily. I think the Europeans broadly understand the American game plan here, which is to use powerful economic tools that both punish Iran and name and shame its leaders and name and shame people tied to its leaders to get the regime to stop some of its destabilizing behavior and come back to the negotiating table. I think the Europeans now, whether they agree with the policy or not, tend to understand this. So while always close coordination with your allies is important here, because there is a demonstrated track record of the administration doing this and being very clear about its ultimate end goal, I don't think for Treasury designations, which is seeming to be the major driver here, Washington would have to coordinate with Brussels or another major European capital.
So, Paula, let's talk about some of the president's top officials this weekend. We were seeing them across the countries here, their view in Iran as rivals. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was in Saudi Arabia. National Security Advisor John Bolton was in Israel. What is the administration hoping to accomplish with their visits there?
Well, specifically with Pompeo, they're working to build a coalition to work against the rising military threat of Iran as they see it. This extends not just to any sort of adversaries in the region, but also to Europe and Asia. But particularly in Europe, they're going to have their work cut out for them because some of our European allies are still frustrated that the Trump administration withdrew from the 2015 agreement. I've also seen several of these European countries send envoys to Tehran. That shows that they are still interested in keeping diplomatic channels open and may not be open to sort of working in this coalition with the U.S.
So critics will say that the U.S. had sanctions on Iran before, and yet we saw hostile action still ensured and ensued after that, and there's been no nuclear negotiation. So, Behnam, how do you think Iran is viewing this move out of the White House? Could it motivate them to come back to the table?
I think when you look at Iranian behavior here, there's a track record and there's a tendency to say no, no, no until they realize that there is no way out but through, until they are forced to say yes. So it's obvious that the regime is going to look at any kind of pressure, whether it's political pressure, military pressure, or even cyber actions, as something that can incentivize them in the short term to buckle down and fight and resist. But ultimately, in the much longer term, if they feel like this is a persistent campaign, then it's going to be something that they're going to have to address face on. And that's why Iran came back to the negotiating table in 2013. And that's why Iran, in fact, ended a war that it said for 7.5 years, war until victory. And then in the 8th year, it came back and ended that war. And that was the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq War. Much of Iran's political, military, and religious elite cut their teeth during that war. So the lessons of that war are still resonating in Iran today. And so some of the successes that Washington had against Tehran during that war, even though it wasn't a major participant, I think are being borne out in international politics today.
Behnam Taleblu and Paula Reed, thank you both for joining us.